Let's go ahead and talk about the differences between pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements. This can be confusing since they are similar in name, but I did want to take a few minutes just to go through what they each are and how they would affect your web page. Basically, a pseudo-class is a selector that assists in the selection of something that cannot be expressed by a simple selector. This would be something like hover or active. A pseudo-element, on the other hand, allows us to create items that do not normally exist in the document tree. An example of this would be something like after or before. The CSS pseudo-class is a state of the selected element when it goes through an event or series of events. You can change the element styles for a particular event using pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes enable you to target an element when it's in a particular state, as if you had added a class for that state to the DOM. In contrast, a CSS pseudo-element behaves like a sub-element itself and adds different functionality to the selected element based on its type. Pseudo-elements act as if you've added a whole new element to the DOM. Once you've added the pseudo-element, you can go ahead and style it in any way. A pseudo-class is a selector that selects an element that are in a specific state. They're either the first element of their type or they're being hovered over by a mouse. They tend to act as if you've applied a class to some part of your document, often helping you cut down on excessive classes in your markup and giving you more flexible and maintainable code. Pseudo-classes are keywords that always start with a colon. This would be something like :link or :visited. You're probably already familiar with quite a few of these. The pseudo-classes select regular elements but under certain conditions. I've gone ahead and grouped the pseudo-classes into different areas. We have dynamic pseudo-classes like link, visited, hover, active, focus. We have UI element states like enabled, disabled, checked, invalid, required, focus within, focus visible. We have structural pseudo-classes like first child, last child, nth-of-type, only of type, root, and empty. And then there's other pseudo-classes like not, target, and lang. Pseudo-elements effectively allow you to create new elements that are not specified in the markup of the document, and then you can manipulate them just like a regular element. This introduces a huge benefit for creating cool effects with minimal markup. It also aids significantly in keeping the presentation of the document out of the HTML and in the CSS where it belongs. With the introduction of CSS 3, the difference between pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements is a lot more clear. As it is now, the standard is to use the double colon. Some early pseudo-elements use the single colon syntax, so you may sometimes see this in code or examples. Modern browsers still support the early pseudo-elements with the single or double syntax, but it is best practice to use double colons when you're creating pseudo-elements. We have quite a few basic pseudo-elements like before, after, first letter, first line, backdrop, file selector button, marker, selection, placeholder, queue, part, and slotted. And then we have browser-specific pseudo-elements like Moz appearance, WebKit appearance, or WebKit search cancel button. Let's take a look at some of the pseudo-classes and some of the pseudo-elements. I won't be going through all of them, but I will touch upon some of the ones that we use more often than others. Here's the finalized page that we're going to be working on. There are quite a few elements on this page that are using both pseudo-classes and pseudo-elements, and I'll be going through how we can use these and what they'll do for our web page. Here's the starting page. This includes some HTML and CSS, but none of the pseudo-classes or elements. Let me show you the code that I'm beginning with. This is my HTML that I'm going to start working with. I have a basic HTML page. I am loading a Google font and Font Awesome. I'm linking out to my external style file, and then I simply have a main element, and within main I have an article with a class of card. It contains an image, a div with a class of card content that contains an H1, an H2, and several paragraphs. I have a link in my last paragraph, and then I have a footer down at the bottom of the page that contains an H3 and a form that allows users to sign up for the weekly newsletter. The CSS that I'm beginning with is taking advantage of CSS variables for colors. I have a basic universal selector that zeroes out both padding, margin, and sets box sizing to border box. I have some rules on my body, and I have some rules for H1, H2, H3, and paragraph. I am taking advantage of the clamp function so that my text is responsive. I have a rule on my main. I have some basic rules on the card item, the card image, the link that I'm using within the card, a general responsive rule for images, and then I have some rules for my footer, for my label, the input item that I'm using, and the button. The button is this submit button right here, which currently does not show anything. We'll be using some of our pseudo elements so that we can actually have this appear with an arrow, and we will make it look more like a button. Let's get into our code and explore some of our pseudo classes and pseudo elements. The first item that we're going to style is going to be our link. The link currently exists inside of a paragraph, and as you can see, when I hover over the link, we don't see any hover styling or any indication that this is a link other than my cursor is changing to the pointer. We'll begin by adding a hover class. The hover class is probably a style that you've used in many web pages. I'm going to go ahead and use a selector of article.card, and then we'll use a:hover. We'll go ahead and we'll specify that the color is going to use a brick red type of shade. So I'll go ahead and enter the hex value. If we save our page and we refresh in the browser, you're going to see when we hover over the text, it is going to now change colors. The pseudo classes for links are probably one of the first pseudo classes that you've learned, since they are commonly used in most web pages. We have the a:link, a:visited, a:hover, and a:active. It is not required that you use all of the link pseudo classes, but if you do use them, you need to follow the correct order. And that is to have the link display first, then visited, then hover, and then active. If you do not place the pseudo classes in this order, you may have issues with the pseudo classes rendering properly. Since this is something that you've probably used in the past, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this pseudo class. We are going to go ahead and enhance our link by adding a graphical item to the link. We'll be using a font awesome arrow just to make this a little bit more visual and to make it stand out a little bit more. In order to take advantage of this, I'm going to use a selector of article.card. Then we're going to use a, and this time we're going to use a pseudo element. Pseudo elements can always be identified by the double colons. So I'm going to use : after. Remember that pseudo elements are basically creating something inside of the DOM that doesn't currently exist. What we'll do here is we'll go ahead and add a rule for content, and the value for content is going to be the ASCII symbol for the arrow that I want to use. I'm going to be taking advantage of a simple font awesome arrow, and the ASCII symbol is \F0DA. This information can be found on the Font Awesome website. Then I'll go ahead and add some additional rules in regards to how I want this to display. I'm going to have this show as inline block. I'm going to set my font family, and because I want to use the Font Awesome icon, I need to specify that the font family is Font Awesome, and I am going to be using the free version of Font Awesome, so I will go ahead and add Font Awesome 6 free. In addition to this, I'm going to need to specify a font weight, and then I'll just add some padding. I'm going to set my padding to 2 pixels on the top, 0 for the right, 0 for the bottom, and 5 pixels for the left. If I save and we refresh, you will notice that the link is now going to display with this arrow. And when I hover over, both the text and the arrow are going to take advantage of our hover pseudo class. Let me go ahead and open up the developer tools so I can show you how this element is being generated in the code. If we go ahead and fish upon the pseudo element, you will see that here's my link. That's the anchor element. And now there's something that exists within the HTML called : after. This is our pseudo element. And if we click this, you can see here is all of the CSS that we've added. This code does not exist in the actual HTML. This is something that's being dynamically added via CSS. So this is a really great feature of pseudo elements. You can actually inject information into your page without having to actually create the content within the HTML. There are lots of ways in which you can use pseudo elements, but this is a very common use of the pseudo element. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to target this last paragraph. Now I could easily go ahead and assign a class or an ID to this paragraph and hook it in that way. But what we're going to do is we're going to use pseudo class so that we can grab this last item. The advantage of using this method is that if I go ahead and change my code and add additional material, this particular condition can still exist. I do want to point out that all of this text-based content, the headings and the paragraphs, do exist inside of the div with a class of card content. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and use that as part of our selector. So I'm going to use .cardContent P, which would get all of the paragraphs that are children of card content. And now I'm going to use a pseudo class of last-of-type. This will allow me to get the last paragraph that exists within card content. We'll go ahead and we'll set the text align to right, and then I'm going to add a border top. I'll use dotted 1 pixel, and for the color I'm going to set a variable, and I'm going to use my background color. If we save now and refresh, you're going to see that the link is pushed over to the right-hand side of the card, and we get a separator line that is going to separate this content from the rest of the content on the page. In addition, I'm going to add a little bit of padding to the top. So we'll add a padding top rule, and we will set that to 0.25 rems. That'll just give a little spacing between the line and the link-based content. Now let's go ahead and target the first paragraph that we have within this area. I could use the class of card content, but because this is the first paragraph, I can also eliminate that and just target the first paragraph. Let's create a rule for P, and here we're going to use first of type. Here I'll use text transform and we'll set this to uppercase. If we refresh now, you're going to see that this paragraph is now going to display as uppercase text. Because this is the first paragraph that appears on my page, it doesn't necessarily need to have the card content. If we had other paragraphs that appeared elsewhere on the page before this paragraph, we might need to be more specific, but in this case, this will work. I needed to have card content on this paragraph, the last of type, because we are using paragraphs elsewhere on our page. And if we just used P last of type, we would be targeting one of the paragraphs in the footer rather than the paragraph that is located within card content. So keep in mind that you will need to adjust your selectors and use specificity depending on what you might need to do. Now, ultimately, I don't actually want to do this. I'm going to get rid of my text transform uppercase, and we are going to go ahead and create a drop cap for the first letter in the paragraph. This is something that you typically would see in printed type of work. Prior to using pseudo classes and pseudo elements, this would be rather hard to create with CSS. But now that we have these elements available, we can easily create design elements such as drop caps with just a few lines of code. I'll start off by specifying the font weight and the font size. We'll also change the font color. Now, currently, we are still targeting the first paragraph. So if we refresh our page, all of these changes are going to affect the first paragraph. That isn't what I want to do. I only want to select the first letter. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to pair the pseudo class with a pseudo element. So we'll add on to the end of first of type, : first letter. Now, if I save the page and refresh, you are going to see that only the first letter of that paragraph has been targeted. When we set these particular rules, you can see that this element is being affected, but it is creating some strange spacing within our paragraph. And typically, this is not how we normally would see a drop cap. Usually the drop cap is going to drop lower into the paragraph and the rest of the text will wrap around it. Since that's what I want to accomplish, I'm going to add some additional CSS rules. We'll be using a float of left. I'm going to set my line height to 0.9, and I'm going to actually change the font family here as well. I'll go ahead and specify a font family, and I'm going to set the font to Georgia, and if that's not available, I'll just default to whatever serif font is available. In addition to this, I'm going to add some padding. I'll be using 4 pixels for the top, 6 pixels for the right, 0 for the bottom, and 0 for the left. In addition to this, I'm going to increase the font size slightly, and I think I will use 4.5 rems. Let's save now and take a look. As you can see, now we have a really good looking drop cap that is going to drop down into the paragraph, and depending on the width of the page and how much content is visible, the text is going to wrap around this drop cap element. This looks more like a traditional print-based drop cap, and this is easily accomplished using some CSS with our pseudo class paired with a pseudo element. Another pseudo class that I want to show you is the not selector. Now, I am not going to be using this on my page, but I do want to show you how it works because it can be really useful in some instances. I'm going to use image:not, and then in parentheses, we're going to pass on what it is that we want to specify, or in this case, what it is that we don't want to specify. I'm going to pair this with an attribute selector, and I'm going to place alt inside. Then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll make a rule, and we'll specify that we want the outline to be solid, 6 pixels, and we'll go ahead and use that same color red that we're using on the hover. If we save the page, you're going to see that nothing changes, and that's because the only image that I'm using does have an alt element. But if we go into the HTML and we delete our alt element from the image tag, which of course is not advisable as alt elements help to increase usability and accessibility on web pages, you will now see that the image is going to show up with a red outline. This can be a great way to work with other people just to ensure that everyone is remembering to place alt elements on all of the images. And then you'll easily be able to identify any images that do not have an alt element. Let's go back into our HTML and we'll add the alt element back in. And now when we refresh the page, you can see that the image is no longer going to display with the outline around it. There are lots of other ways that you can use not, but I did want to demonstrate how this is used so that you can get an idea of how you may want to use it within your projects. Now let's move on to the bottom of this card. We're going to be working on the footer. Specifically, we're going to be working on the input element and the button. Currently, if I click within this element, you're going to see that a border shows up or an outline. And if I go ahead and enter an incorrect email address and click my submit button, you'll see that the default HTML5 validation message is going to pop up letting us know that this is not a valid email address. We're going to go ahead and use some CSS so we can give our user a little bit more of a visual feedback in regards to whether this will work. We also want the button to line up with the input field, and I'm going to get rid of this outline since it doesn't really work with my design. In order to do this, we're going to use a series of pseudo classes. So I'll come down to the area of my CSS where I have my rule for input, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this outline that's showing up. We'll use input::focus, and we're going to specify that the outline is set to 0. If we save our page now and we refresh, when we click in this field, we no longer get that outline. Sometimes the outline might be something that you want, but depending on your design, you may want to have more control over the color or the styling of the outline, or in some cases, you may want to get rid of it completely. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use the pseudo class of valid. This is how we want the input element to look if the input is valid for that particular input type. I'm going to go ahead and specify that the background color is my light color. Before we test this, let's go ahead and make a rule for input invalid as well. This, of course, is going to display if the information is not valid. What we're going to do here is we're going to change the text color. We'll be using that same brick red color that we're using elsewhere, and I'm going to use a font weight of bold. If we save now and we refresh, you will see that if we click in this field and we begin to type, if the text is not valid for this specific type of input, it will show red and bold. So as soon as I start to add information that is going to display as an actual email address, you will see two things happen. The background color of this field is going to change and the text is going to revert back to the default color, and it's no longer going to be bold. This is a great way that you can give a user visual feedback as they're typing to ensure that you're collecting the correct sort of information. It is worth mentioning that when you're using HTML5, you can test to see if something is within the valid format. So as soon as I put the name and an @ symbol and then something else, it's going to assume this is valid. Clearly, this is not a valid email address, but it does follow the pattern that is reminiscent of an email address. So rather than someone just typing a bunch of gibberish, they're at least going to know if they're within the right sort of formatting. Finally, I'm going to style the placeholder text. This time we'll be using a pseudo element. So we'll use the double colons and we're going to type input : placeholder. Here I'm going to go ahead and specify the color. I'm going to use the dark color variable that I'm using elsewhere on my page. I'm going to use font style of italic and font weight of normal. If we save our page and we refresh, you're going to see that the text is now going to be displayed as italic and within the color that we requested. Now, as soon as we click in the area and we start to type, we're going to get our invalid styling until we meet the criteria that is going to assume that this is now a valid email address. And as soon as we do that, our valid styles are going to kick in. The final element that we're going to style is going to be the button. So currently our HTML button does not actually contain any HTML. Even though this is a submit button, I didn't pass in any text, so no text is going to show up. I did this because I wanted to style the button with just a simple arrow. Once again, I'm going to use Font Awesome to be able to do this. We're going to use the pseudo element of : after once again, and I'm going to do something similar to what we did with our anchor link. So I'm going to specify that the content be a ASCII value for the particular arrow that I want to show up. This one is going to be another Font Awesome arrow, but it is a slightly different style, so the ASCII code is a little bit different. I'm going to use a display of inline block. I need to set my font family to my Font Awesome 6 free. Font weight will be 900, and I'm going to add some padding on the left, and we'll pass in 5 pixels for this. If we save our page and we refresh, you will now see that we get a little arrow inside of our button, and the user can go ahead and enter the information, and then they can click this to submit this particular form element. As you can see, we used a variety of pseudo classes and pseudo elements in order to style the page, and I think we made some small improvements, but we definitely increased the design aspect of this particular page and took advantage of using pseudo classes and pseudo elements within CSS.